this idea of freely, chasing your passions and just doing something that interests you comes from an immense place of privilege. And culturally, for me, it wasn't characteristic of the dialogue growing up. Your job, at least in my family's context, was not something that you were necessarily supposed to be passionate about or needed to love. It was very much a means to an end, and it was a very striking comparison between starting at Swellbox full time or pursuing a more risk protected, financially secure path in finance. I think I make a bunch of unconscious decisions that are a function of how I was raised and what those values espouse.
You're listening to Brown University's special podcast series on immigrant entrepreneurship, showcasing the background and experiences of founders making their mark in communities all around you. I'm Caitlin Pintaborn, your host for this episode. Today, we're going to be focusing on 22-year-old Stephen Cho, how he came from South Korea to Canada and finally to the States to help build Swellbox, a digital health startup, and how his career path has changed in a more corporate role as an investment banker at Evercore. A few years ago, I saw this viral tweet go around written by Bo Ren, who's been really successful within the tech product management scene. Her tweet said, "My parents were tasked with the job of survival and I with self-actualization. The immigrant generational gap is real. What a luxury it is to search for purpose, meaning, and fulfillment." As a second-gen immigrant myself, I really resonated with this line of thinking, saying to myself, how lucky I am to be in a position where I can essentially freely choose who I want to be and what job I want to have, all mostly as a result of the sacrifices my parents made in moving from Thailand to the US. I think the sentiment echoes pretty soundly across many second-gen immigrant children and first-gen immigrants who moved to the US at a young age. And I want to explore how people with these identities reconcile their cultural background and family history with this novel concept of charting their own career path, specifically surrounding entrepreneurship. So for this April 14th episode, I'm sitting here today with Stephen Cho in New York City to talk to him about his story.
I grew up in Northwest Canada in Calgary, Alberta. We immigrated from Seoul, South Korea, where I was originally born, in August of 2002 when I was 6 years old. My little sister and my parents are the first in my family to have ever immigrated away from South Korea, so the remainder of my relatives still live in Korea. And I'd say growing up it was an interesting dynamic because we didn't have cousins or grandparents or relatives of any sort for the major duration of my upbringing. I visited Korea a handful of times during that period, but grew up in Calgary all the way through high school, and then I opted to come to the States for undergrad. I just graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 2018. I did 2 degrees in neuroscience and ward and healthcare management, and started that period with every intention of doing 4 years of neuroscience and going to med school. And halfway through, just around the time we started Swellbox, actually, I became a lot more interested in healthcare entrepreneurship and healthcare investing and opted for that career path out of undergrad. So currently I work at Evercore. It's an investment bank in New York, and I'm a mergers and acquisitions analyst. I'll be heading to a healthcare TMT private equity investing role afterwards, and my co-founders currently run Smallbox full-time.
So why the move to Canada?
It was purely for the sake of allowing myself and my little sister to have a wider range of opportunities and more say in what we would eventually end up doing than had we grown up in South Korea. The education system there is, I think, internationally known to be super demanding and rigid, and most people end up being told what to do based on their academic performance more so than the Western approach to the same path, which is a little bit more empowering and more liberal arts, and allows you to chart your own path to a greater extent. So, I'm eternally grateful for the decision that was essentially made on my behalf when I was super young, but it's hard to think about now. My parents were 32 when we immigrated, and they had lived the entire duration of their lives in South Korea, moved to a country where they didn't speak the language or have any of their skills transferable. I think it's a really hard decision for any family to make, but really grateful that I think we're reaping some dividends from that now.
And of all places to go to, how did your parents go about choosing Calgary, Alberta?
It was super arbitrary, to be honest. We had a couple family friends that worked with my dad, the only people we had ever known who immigrated before us. And in all of North America, the place that they had chosen to go was Calgary, Alberta. But that was the reason we decided to move. It was the only point of reference we had. So it helped a lot having somebody that we had known from our previous life, share in our acclimation period here. It was even just little things like being able to, spend bi-weekly coffees talking over, where to go for Korean food, or like where the best groceries were to, buy ingredients that we could then, cook food that we missed with, and, where to go in the city to meet other people who had immigrated, and where to go, for job interviews, like all these little things that you don't think about, that I think you take for granted in a country where you're comfortable. It helped a lot just having one more family friend who was able to, assist with those things.
Were there any obstacles in transitioning that you may have heard about or can remember?
My parents did a wonderful job of sustaining the illusion that everything was being handled smoothly, and that I wasn't any different from the peers that I was going to school with. I think along the way, of course, there are cultural transition points where you realize that your background and your upbringing are different, but I wouldn't say I noticed it very much growing up. I was very privileged in that sense. My parents provided every opportunity for me to feel that this was my home, and feel that it was a place where I deserved and belonged to be.
So you mentioned the term home. You were born in South Korea, moved to Canada, and then came to the States for school and for work. What exactly does home mean to you now?
It's something that I've always placed a lot of tangible value on. And to your point, yeah, we moved around quite a fair bit, and my family is spread out geographically. In the continental United States, I don't have any immediate family, and it's been that way since 2014. At certain times, it can feel lonely in the sense that I'm geographically far from people who really care about me. But I think there's a big difference connotatively between a physical location and what you would call a home or a sense of place. And I think it has a lot to do with being centered in investing in the things around you that are valuable to you outside of just your goals for the future. It's, for me, always been about balancing present tense priorities with future tense aspirations. And I think, especially in my upbringing, and this may be characteristic of other immigrant families as well, it's always about your goals and what's going to be accomplished in the future, and what you're doing now to prepare for later. Yeah, I think that sense of place is really important, and will continue to be, as these inflection points come up later in my life.
I know I've asked you a lot of questions on your upbringing, so now I want to move a bit more into understanding how you shaped your career path from there. You came into college with your heart set on med school, and then you explored healthcare entrepreneurship and finance. So where exactly did this interest come from? Did you have anyone in your family who were in these fields?
Actually, no. And I think if, I had a family of physicians back home, the issue would have been reinforced and potentially worse. Neither of my parents are in medicine or in finance. My dad works at a car dealership, and my mom used to design wedding dresses before she decided to, stay at home full time for us. And I think maybe it's also a grass is greener complex for them, in the sense that these are features that they never had for themselves. And because of that, they, so desperately want their kids and their kids to essentially live out like the dreams they weren't able to, because of their sacrifices that allowed us to immigrate here. So I get a lot of that kind of pushback from my parents now when, certain things will come up that they disagree with, but it's very much now more of a discussion rather than being told what you're supposed to do. And that's been a recent change in our relationship.
You mentioned this constant dialogue about your career with your parents. I imagine they must have had a lot of influence in how you fundamentally thought about your academic and professional career.
I think it played a very instrumental role, and especially in the case of Swellbox, I saw those things coming to light pretty concretely, in the sense that this idea of freely, chasing your passions and just doing something that interests you comes from an immense place of privilege. And culturally, for me, it wasn't characteristic of the dialogue growing up. Your job, at least in my family's context, was not something that you were necessarily supposed to be passionate about or needed to love. It was very much a means to an end, and it was a very striking comparison between starting at Swellbox full time, or pursuing a more risk protected, financially secure path in finance that would also preserve optionality. I think, I make a bunch of unconscious decisions that are a function of how I was raised and what those values espouse. There was a period of time where I was really passionate about wanting to do Swellbox full time. I still am. I hold my board seat, and my co-founders and I are very close. So I still keep a semi-active role, but this huge premium placed on just risk security and locking down for yourself a sense of prestige and ownership over that is a constant dialogue in immigrant families, I think, because there is so much to be said for the insecurities that come from placing yourself in a very unfamiliar environment and wanting to secure certain assets and hatch down certain variables that you fear will jeopardize the things that you continue to value in life.
Okay, so let's talk about this breakaway from that initial plan and your family's wishes for you to pursue medicine. When you came to college and decided to pursue a more entrepreneurial finance route, how was that decision perceived by your parents?
They were, to be honest, and still are to this day, heartbroken that I'm not in med school. And it's a funny thing to be able to see your parents react in that way and understand yet not agree with the cultural backbone of where that's coming from. And I think as we grew up and as we checked certain boxes for them that were valuable, I was given a little bit more freedom to make decisions for myself in a way that inevitably is influenced by their values, but is independent finally of their direction. So in that way, I think I'm starting to develop a sense of agency away from that. And it's a constant negotiation of reconciling what to be your cultural background with the things that you have to be malleable to, and also prioritize that challenge some of those foundational tenets.
So let's take it back to when you first got to school. You were 17 years old, going to college in a new country. How did you know what to do and where to go from there?
Everyone looks back on certain periods of their life with rose-colored glasses, and I have pretty idealistic memories of what undergrad was like. But when we first started, to your point, I didn't really know anyone. My family was not here, and a lot of people come into these universities like Brown or Penn with groups of friends who went to magnet schools or family who used to go there. They come in with these pre-built-in networks that I just did not have. And yeah, I fought very desperately at first to try to craft myself one. And I think it's necessary in the sense that you need to go through that rite of passage and eventually get okay with the discomfort to reach beyond where you're at. But yeah, I read this book called Never Eat Alone freshman year. It's by a guy named Keith Ferrazzi, and it's the concept of always having something to learn or something to contribute to the person across the table from you, whether it be a complete stranger or someone that you look up to. And so freshman year, very concretely, I actually had every meal of the day with a different person, at least 3 or 4 times a week for the better part of that year. And it cemented in me an ability to, subsede my ego or, my discomfort to a desire to ask for advice and to reach out to people that I looked up to or needed to ask questions of. And I think that was ultimately the only reason why I was able to take a more entrepreneurial path outside of what, was a known quantity to me at the time.
Okay, so I want to shift gears a bit and get more into exactly why healthcare, why entrepreneurship, and how Swellbox started. So to start off, what draws you into healthcare entrepreneurship?
So as I mentioned before, I started as a single degree neuroscience candidate at Penn. And before that, I had been involved in a number of clinical research stints during high school. So I came into college having co-authored a couple papers in endometrial pathology and also in clinical oncology, and wanted to double down on just a very quantitative understanding of data science and of the life sciences. That evolved into an interest in public health when I first got more exposure to the healthcare management side of things. I spent a summer with the World Health Organization, co-authored an e-health article with UNESCO, and I think that kind of had a double-edged effect. I really enjoyed health policy in the public sector, but I also saw how inherently slow and flawed and inefficient it was, and it piqued my interest in a more disruptive alternative to following the well-trodden path of becoming a physician, of marrying that with hospital administration, of following the very politically correct path through the ranks. And that's really what got me interested in entrepreneurship and ultimately in healthcare private equity.
So how did all this interest turn into co-founding Swellbox?
So it came at a pretty interesting time for me. My co-founders are not my age. I have 2 of them. Our current CEO is a class of 96 Wharton alum, and our CMO, our Chief Medical Officer, is a graduate of Harvard Medical School. And they're both full-time real adults, have kids, work in Westchester, New York. Like, these are people that I didn't think to be the likely profile of the co-founders I would have, if I decided to start something out of undergrad. The reason I say it came at an interesting time is because I was just thinking about, what healthcare might look like outside of, med school and the clinical setting, and, what I could potentially work on to become more well-versed in that. They had just built the technology that would allow Swellbox to eventually aggregate health data for individual patients and come back to our CEO's alma mater, Penn, to crowdsource some interest and do some focus groups on whether students might take an interest in this. So I hopped on at a pretty serendipitous time, and I'd say a lot of things in life happen that way. But the foundational basis of starting the company was that the three of us believed that every single patient, no matter their background, socioeconomic or otherwise, should have access to their health data because it's theirs. And, that was reason enough for us to start a company that would make that a reality.
So for listeners who aren't super familiar with the healthcare space, could you speak a little bit more about what sorts of opportunities there are for innovation in the interoperability EHR space that Smallbox is trying to solve?
Sure. So I think the world bifurcates when you talk about health records. The traditional, bastion of that space is really the privately owned EHR companies that control most of the medical records that flow through today's current hospital systems. And these EHR companies, namely the biggest ones are Epic, Allscripts, Molina, etc. These have essentially led to siloed parts of the universe that really don't communicate with each other. It's as if what originally was intended to be a universal communication system that would allow the patient to travel all 50 states and essentially be able to carry with them a seamless record, a longitudinal record of their health records. It became a hyper-fragmented space that is made up of 70 languages and companies that don't interface and don't talk to each other. And the flip side of that are these connector companies that are essentially trying to build organic connections and bridges between traditionally private companies that don't talk to each other and don't want data to be interoperable. So the interoperability movement is really a push towards deprivatizing and decentralizing the control of those medical records away from private health data companies and back towards patients, and this idea of building a cloud-based, patient-centric health records model is essentially a completely bottoms-up build that rewrites the way that our current health system handles data.
And what is Swellbox's ultimate value proposition?
Healthcare is at least a decade behind every other vertical in the sense that it's not as tech-enabled and as user-friendly as it should be. It's wildly inefficient, and especially in the U.S., I think those inefficiencies are often exploited. But when we originally started the company, it was all about simplifying that process to the end user, which in this case is the patient. So we tackled a pretty unsexy problem, electronic health records, and tried to turn it into something more intuitive that the patient would not be scared of using. So current day, Swellbox is a healthcare software company that sells directly to health systems, and we sell a suite of software solutions that we believe will help hospitals and health systems provide a more user-friendly experience to the end patient. So these things encompass a health record requester wizard that allows patients to request their records and transmit them electronically. We also built a chatbot that allows student health centers to employ a software solution that will allow students to ask 24/7 questions about different things that they may need healthcare related. And we also built an API solution that allows other software companies to plug in data solutions through our essentially open application interface with the hospital.
So what's its business model? Who are your customers and end users?
So the company was started direct to consumer, but we make none of our money off of that stream. That this school aspect became more of a proof of concept training ground for us to check the box that the solution worked, and we would continue to be able to provide it directly to patients and students for free. We now monetize completely B2B. We sell our technology pretty much on a software subscription basis to health systems and to health data centers. And by doing that, we're able to repurpose those revenues towards building both better solutions for our B2B customers and a more user-friendly interface for our current patient base that we directly serve but do not charge.
So it sounds like Swellbox has pivoted to read more like a software company on the balance sheet. So how do you and your founders get all of the funding to do what Swellbox is doing?
So Swellbox is completely bootstrapped. We've been super fortunate not to have had to take on outside funding to date, but obviously the goal is in the near future we would take on some institutional capital and continue to grow the business.
And could you give us some updates on how Swellbox has been doing lately? How many users does Swellbox currently have?
So in our early stages, we were just about proving the concept with a critical mass number of student health users at universities. So once we hit 2,500 patient accounts, we considered that box checked and focused our business elsewhere. I'd say our number of health accounts hovers around that 2,500 because the only people in the world today that can use Swellbox are students at Penn, Harvard, and Stanford, which were our 3 pilot schools. We currently serve 3 health systems that are revenue generating.
And to close, I want to ask you one last question. What kind of professional do you ultimately want to be? Is another venture in your future?
So I think the one thing I've prioritized early in my career that may not be as characteristic, I think, of the median going mentality in people in their 20s is that I think optionality is one thing and everybody solves for that. The other aspect of it I've tried to be diligent about is picking a specialty and doubling down on it to the extent I can early. And it's a little bit counterintuitive because your ability to pick a specialty and be the best at that one thing is also codependent on your ability to put that in the perspective of other strengths you have, other cross disciplines that it touches. And I think that cross-disciplinary piece of it is something that I've really valued and want to continue prioritizing. So to be concrete about it, I finished the neuroscience degree, but for the rest of undergrad, I largely focused on entrepreneurship and finance and investing, traditionally things that I was not as familiar with. But I'm so fortunate to have been able to marry an academic interest in the life sciences with a curiosity for entrepreneurial career paths, as well as just the rigor of the finance industry. And I think it's led to a repertoire of skills that I now hope is more palatable to what I do next. And although I'm headed into a healthcare private equity investing role within the next year here or so, I think I benefit tremendously from having taken this circuitous path to get there. It gives you the ability to build connections in your mind between concepts that seem on the surface unrelated, and I think that gives you the ability to think in a differentiated way, and especially in the investing space, that's super important because the entire point is to bet on ideas early and to disagree with the crowd. And my philosophy is that if everyone is doing something already or thinks that it's a smart idea, it's probably too late to be the real differentiator and disruptor there. I think the struggle is that once you choose the more career established path and the one that guarantees you a lot less risk, it's like a loss aversion behavioral economics complex where you become much more averse to losing the things that you have than, hopefully gaining things that you don't currently. So my worry is that, as I continue to go down this path, if I do, it will become harder and harder to switch off the inertia and, completely upend my status quo for, a great idea or a co-founder I'm excited about and go start a company because, life is not as simplistic as that connotes a bunch of different fundamental changes in your daily routine that also are instrumental in your decision making process. So I really hope that an entrepreneurial venture is in my future, but in the very least I want to be entrepreneurial and thoughtful and less conventional about the decisions I am making in my career,